This was the year of Operation Spiderweb and a surge in strikes on Russian oil infrastructure, from rigs to trains and most recently Shadow Fleet tankers. It was the year of Russian drones attacking Europe, of Donald Trump's dizzying policy U-turns, and we're told the end of Pax Americana. And it was another year of carnage across the front lines as Russia blasted its way forward, at most 40 kilometers at an extraordinary cost of 300,000 soldiers dead and injured. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defense editor at The Sun, and this is Frontline, a special end-of-year look back at what's happened in the war in Ukraine over the course of 2025. If I had to pick two things that will be remembered in the history books from this war, then it was most certainly going to be Operation Spiderweb, that spectacular Ukrainian sabotage operation thousands of miles behind Russian front lines, and Donald Trump's lurch towards Moscow, the year when we saw President Zelensky bullied, harassed, harangued at the White House, and an end to the comfortable assumption that America was a reliable ally. Operation Spiderweb, cast your minds back. That was a successful Ukrainian attack that hit, according to Kyiv, some 41 Russian aircraft across 4 Russian bases, the furthest of which was some 4,000 kilometers east of the closest Ukrainian-held territory. How did they do it? An elaborate, incredibly elaborate operation that took some 18 months in the planning, where they smuggled drones into Ukraine, fitted them into the false roofs, false cavity spaces in custom-made containerized rooms, which they then had delivered by unwitting Russian drivers to destinations across the country, so that these drones could get past Russia's layered air defenses. These sea containers had solar panels on their roofs to power their own communication and to power the drones. Those roofs on the 1st of June were then peeled back, and those drones flew off towards their targets, hitting Tupolev 95 slow, long-range, nuclear-capable bombers, Tupolev 23s, Tupolev 160s, all of these strategic, long-range Russian bombers, all of which had been used to hit targets in Ukraine, and Beriev A-50 air traffic control aircraft, absolutely essential for Russia, very scarce, very valuable, because they allow Russia to sort of understand the air picture of their assets, their aircraft, what's in the sky, what's theirs, and what's hostile, what the missiles are that might be coming towards them. A spectacular success, one of those moments after years of war that really certainly made me, certainly made you, made the world sit up and take notice. A reminder that despite the grinding Russian offensives, Ukraine was very much far from beaten. And just recently, we've seen another strike, I think, that had the same effect, and that was the SBU's submarine Sea Baby drone attack against a Russian Kilo-class submarine in the Novorossiysk port, eastern edge of the Black Sea. That's the port that Russia's fleet, its Black Sea fleet, had been forced to retreat to put it outside the range of Russian drones. Ukraine managed to get a submarine drone into that port, exploded it at the stern of one of these submarines. Estimates vary that submarine on its own worth between $200 and $400 million. So really spectacular. And there was, because if an event happens in this conflict, it almost doesn't matter if it's not seen. And in this instance, there was spectacular CCTV footage, it appeared to be, of that plume of water, that enormous explosion. All of that came against a backdrop of relentless strikes, long-range Ukrainian strikes against Russia's oil infrastructure. So if the earlier years in this conflict were defined by Russia's targeting of Ukraine's energy infrastructure, particularly its heating and thermal plants to give people light and power, 2025 for me defined by Ukraine's campaign against Russia's oil infrastructure. Most recently, that's been an oil rig in the Caspian Sea serving about 20 wells. Over the course of the year, that's been oil refineries, oil storage sites, gas transshipment plants, pipelines, trains, fuel trains, and most recently the Shadow Fleet tankers, around 5 of which have been struck in the Black Sea and potentially further afield, although that's not been confirmed. All of that part of Ukraine's attempt to hit the Kremlin's coffers. What new weapons have we seen this year? Any changes in tactics? I think, yes, there have been a few. I mean, week by week, it can all feel pretty samey, but when you take a step back, 2025 has been dominated by fiber optic drones. These weapons first appeared around halfway through 2024, but they were novel, they were experimental. Both sides now have massively scaled up their production. Fiber optic, wire-guided FPV drones. These are immune to electronic warfare jamming. It makes them incredibly dangerous. It means that their operators can see a very high-resolution 4K feed from the camera, so they can see where they're flying. They can fly in difficult visibility conditions. That is why, for example, or it certainly contributed really significantly to this idea of the kill zone, that 10 or 20 kilometer belt that stretches either side of the front lines, where almost anything that moves can be seen and can be attacked. It's why we've seen the rise of these drone nets over key arterial routes that soldiers on both sides have to use to try and defend them from those attacks. These drones have become ubiquitous. We've also seen the rise of the interceptor drones, particularly the sort of quadcopter style miniature rockets which take off vertically, can fly quite fast. Why are they important? Well, because Russia this year has massively increased its production of the Shahed or the Geran, Iranian-designed one-way kamikaze, long-range one-way kamikaze drones. So it uses those to overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses. Ukraine, if it's forced to use expensive missiles against the Shahed, depletes that stockpile, doesn't have those missiles available to hit the more advanced, the even more sophisticated, more deadly, faster cruise and ballistic missiles that Russia fires. So it needs, both sides need cheaper interceptors to shoot down drones, and we've seen Ukraine using more and more of those. We've also seen increased use of the jet-powered Shaheds. Again, that technology came in slightly before 2025, although this year, for the first time, we've also seen air-to-air missiles on Shahed drones, a recognition by Russia that it needs to do more to try and defend its fleet of drones, its attack drones, as they come in, because Ukraine is getting better at defending them. As ever, war, a sort of evolution and a process of one side leapfrogging the other with technology to try and keep pace, to try and get an advantage. In terms of changes of tactics on the front line, we've seen a lot more this year of the sort of very small unit tactics, tiny groups of soldiers, sometimes as few as 4 infantry soldiers advancing, largely unsupported, to try and make their way through gaps in the front line. We've seen more use of motorbikes, more use of quad bikes, but effectively Russia trying to present a more dispersed, less attractive target to Ukrainian drones and artillery. And part of that has been to exploit the gaps in Ukraine's front line. And Ukraine has had gaps because it's got a chronic manpower crisis, a shortage of soldiers. And so the soldiers defending those zero-line positions are more sparsely, more thinly spread, creating those opportunities for Russia. We saw that east of Dobropilya, quite successful for Russia. Briefly, they spurted in, although those soldiers later got pushed back. We've seen the same tactic used in the assault in Pokrovsk, which has been among one of Russia's most significant battlefield advances. It's around the Pokrovsk direction where Russia made its biggest gains this year of about 40 kilometers. If we're to look at other significant Russian gains, the collapse of Siversk in northeastern Donbass, also worth noticing. And of course, in Kursk, Russian Kursk, where they have managed to push Ukrainian forces fully out of sovereign Russian territory. So the Ukrainians invaded in 2024, surprise assault into Russia. They held that territory with some difficulty, with extraordinary ingenuity for some time, but Russia used these fiber optic drone tactics effectively to choke off their supplies. That tactic proved successful, using drones to choke supplies. We saw that same tactic used in Pokrovsk as well. Over the course of the last 12 months or so, Russia has managed to capture around 4,600 kilometers, between 4,600 and 5,000 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. On one hand, that sounds like a lot, but it's less than 1% of Ukraine's landmass. So broadly speaking, Russia still holds around 20% of sovereign Ukrainian territory. And Russia has paid a huge price for those gains. Around 300,000 of its soldiers have been wounded or killed over the course of 2025. As if biggest gains around 40 kilometers. In other parts, actually, their gains have been much smaller, around 15 kilometers. In some areas, 3. And in Kupiansk, in northeastern Kharkiv province, reports towards the end of 2025 of Ukraine making successful counterattacks. So it hasn't all been one way. Of course, everything this year has been against the backdrop of Donald Trump's presidency and his extraordinary lurch towards Moscow, a kind of alignment between the aims of Washington and Russia, which has not only wrong-footed Ukraine spectacularly, but also left European NATO allies and indeed Canada deeply, deeply concerned. The standout moment of this policy was President Zelensky's first meeting with Donald Trump in the White House, where Zelensky was greeted by Trump, mocking him, saying, "I see you've dressed up today," ironically, because Zelensky was wearing his trademark military fatigues. Zelensky was then harangued by Vice President J.D. Vance in the Oval Office, and we saw one of these sort of pet MAGA journalists, I don't think journalist is really a fair word, also insulting President Zelensky for not wearing a suit. It was extraordinary. It left Ukraine, and indeed it left Ukraine's allies, in no doubt that America had become significantly less dependable. And dependability is essential in an ally because deterrence relies on dependability, because dependability creates credibility. We also saw Vladimir Putin fated in Alaska. That has to be a standout moment from 2025. And whilst less visually memorable, we've also seen these extraordinary reports of Donald Trump's peace envoy, Steve Witkoff, being caught on intercepted phone calls coaching a Kremlin aide on how to play Donald Trump. Witkoff was recorded speaking to Kirill Dmitriev, who is one of Vladimir Putin's chief negotiators, manages Russia's sovereign wealth fund, and has been acting as an envoy in these peace negotiations. Witkoff was explaining to Dmitriev how to present a deal to try and get Donald Trump to buy it. What was that deal? It was a 28-point peace plan, which we also know Russia had deliberately made a decision to put in its maximalist demands, even though they thought they might be unrealistic, put in its maximalist demands. To Trump's credit, we cannot escape the fact that it is his presidency, it's his determination to try and end this war, which has got us to the point where Russia and Ukraine are trading proposals for peace. Some of those proposals have been extraordinary. The first one, that 28-point Russian peace plan, read like a surrender document. But nonetheless, it is a significant step forward. It's been a number of significant steps forward that the two sides are working on documents, accepting them, reworking them under pretty intense, stressful conditions, whether that's the meetings in Miami, they don't seem that stressful, but certainly the meetings with Ukrainian negotiators and American diplomats that have taken place in Geneva, they have been pretty high stakes. Behind all of that, the undercurrent has been trying to understand what is really motivating President Trump. A lot of speculation that he wants a peace prize. Don't think there's any doubt in that. He's almost said it, I think. But the Wall Street Journal did some amazing reporting on the business connections, how Trump donors have been actually holding discreet conversations with Russian businessmen about securing multi-billion-dollar business deals, pipeline deals for Nord Stream, for an Arctic pipeline, in the event that there is a ceasefire and that sanctions on Russia have lifted. The White House, the Donald Trump White House, views the world through a lens of business opportunities. For me personally, there are, I think, a couple of things that will stand out that I haven't mentioned. The first is that in January, I was put on a Russian wanted list, and that was by a court in Kursk in retribution for my reporting from occupied Russian Kursk. So when Ukraine held that territory, I went there. Russia has responded by accusing me of entering the country illegally, patently absurd accusation, and put me on a wanted list. I was also in Ukraine in February. I've been there 4 times this year. I was in Ukraine in February and March when Zelensky had that awful first meeting in the White House. And actually, soon afterwards, I was in a first field hospital near Pokrovsk, in a what Ukraine calls a stabilization point. It was a mobile stabilization point because the front line was so fluid, it needed to be able to move. And I remember particularly speaking to the surgeons and the doctors there just after they'd saved a soldier's life. He'd arrived with horrific burn injuries from an FPV drone strike. I saw them knuckle deep in his body, pulling out pieces of shrapnel. And as they finished that operation, as he was whisked into an ambulance for his onward journey to more advanced care, they joked with me, should we wear suits? And that was obviously a reference to what had happened in the Oval Office, a real sense of their simmering fury at the way Zelensky had been treated. The other thing I think that will stand out is I ended the year in a hospital as well, where I met a number of soldiers who had been horrifically injured. So they were much further down their recovery and rehabilitation. They were at a rehabilitation centre supported by British soldiers. And I met a mother called Elena who had lost both of her legs, one of her arms, and some of the fingers on her remaining hand. And I asked her what she thought about the peace process, because I expected that somebody who suffered such horrific injuries may well be wishing for no one else to go through that sort of pain, to have that sort of prospect in front of her, and that she might be arguing for almost peace at any price. But I was surprised. Her response was this: should I have one question? What has everybody died for if we give into Russia? So whilst the mood in Ukraine has been pretty grim this year, there is a weariness, there is a chronic shortage of soldiers or volunteers to become soldiers. All of those are real problems. President Zelensky's government has been rocked by a massive corruption scandal, which has sort of undermined faith in him inside Ukraine and outside Ukraine. And yet, nonetheless, the people who are fighting to defend Ukraine remain determined to fight for Ukraine. That doesn't mean the soldiers on the front line aren't angry at the civilians behind the front lines refusing to volunteer. There are all sorts of complexities running through these statements. But I think Elena really surprised me with her determination. She said to me, despite losing 2 legs and arms, she wanted to get back to the front, but she joked she wasn't sure her commander would accept her. But she didn't want those deaths, all those deaths of her comrades and the people like her who've been maimed. She didn't want those deaths to be in vain. Finally, what should we look for next year? What's going to happen next? I dearly hope that I will wake up one morning and think this episode of Frontline has become completely outdated because there has suddenly been a ceasefire and peace has broken out. That's what Donald Trump is pushing for. He wants a sudden deal. Nobody, I said it before, who's seen this conflict, no sane person wants it to go on a day longer than it has to. The truth is that every serious person I speak to tells me that Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin, are not serious about brokering peace. They've shown no signs so far of making serious concessions. Indeed, Putin, in his most recent public comments, was saying it was inevitable that his original war aims would be achieved. And those war aims are the subjugation of Ukraine. He does not believe it has a right to exist. So if there isn't a sudden ceasefire, what is the most likely outcome? Unfortunately, it is this conflict grinding on until one side or both sides realize that peace is the best option, that they have to settle with each other. Ukraine is willing to negotiate. At the moment, Russia isn't. So something has to happen to make Russia want to sue for peace. The worst outcome, as we look ahead, is that Donald Trump loses patience. And if he does lose patience, he could take either side. But the worst case scenario for Ukraine is that he loses patience and he takes Russia's side. He pulls support, intelligence, weapons, whatever he can, as he's threatened to do, as he did briefly in February. And that would clearly give Russia a significant upper hand. Thank you for watching this. Thank you for watching Frontline throughout 2025 and ever since it started. If you've got any questions, please do ask them in the comments below and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next year.